The best map for every Overwatch hero, let's get into it. D.Va. Her best map is likely Dorado in my opinion. Because of how flexible D.Va is as a hero, she's honestly good on most maps, but her best maps are ones where there's tons of angles and high grounds, giving her boosters and defense matrix more value. Her worst map has to be Lijiang Control Center. Unless the enemy team are running Pharmacy Ashe, you're basically trolling picking D.Va on that specific map for Lijiang. It's way too enclosed and short sightlined for her, meaning she gets rolled by heroes like Reinhardt and Zarya on that map. Doomfist. His best map I think is Nepal Sanctum or Nepal Shrine. My reasoning is that it's relatively short sightlines and the maps have decent amounts of cover, allowing him to get value off his slams, whilst also having flanks for Doomfist to approach from and utilise. They're not too linear is my point. His worst map has to be Havana. Junkertown and Circle Royale are also good picks, all for the reason that they're just too long sightlined, meaning he takes 1000 damage before he can even do anything. Junkerqueen. Super powerful as of the release of this video, but I think Queen's best map is Colosseo. It's not too short sightlined that heroes like Reinhardt will just run her over, but it's not too long sightlined that heroes like Widow will just dominate. It's also pretty linear, meaning it's hard to take angles onto her. Her worst map is I think probably Watchpoint Gibraltar. Her lack of mobility, both horizontal and vertical, makes it really hard to even clear high grounds, and something like a Winston would be much more fitting. Orisa. I think likewise to Junkerqueen, her best map is Colosseo. Plenty of walls for her to land her javelin, whilst also not being susceptible to angles too much. Worst map is probably Junkertown. I could not tell you what Orisa's gonna do on this map. The sightlines are too long for her to land the javelin, or to even get up close and brawl, especially if you're up against a Sigma. Ramattra. Aside from Junkerqueen, he's probably the best Pokeball tank in the game, so it's hard to choose a map that he's best at. I certainly think any of the Lijiang maps are up there, as well as Antarctic Peninsula, King's Row, Midtown, Bastion Mecha Base, Colosseo, etc. However, his worst map really comes down to abusing his lack of mobility. On Gibraltar, I think he can struggle quite a bit, and even Hollywood if you're excluding first points. Reinhardt. Lijiang Control Center has to be his bread and butter. Super close range, and he's so good on that map that no matter the meta we're in, Reinhardt will still always see playtime on that map in the Overwatch League. Worst map is likely Watchpoint Gibraltar again. The lack of vertical mobility really hurts him here, and on second point attack, you're really gonna struggle if you're playing Reinhardt. Roadhog. Best map, none. Worst map, all of them. Don't play this hero until Season 7. Unless maybe if you're on Ilios well. Sigma. Best maps here are going to be a contest between Havana, Junkertown, and Circle Royale. I'd ever so slightly lean towards Circle Royale because at least on Havana, I could see something like a Reinhardt spawn camp strategy working. Shambali is also an underrated shout. Worst map, I'm leaning towards Lijiang because any dive or brawl tank work pretty well on any Lijiang map, and I cannot tell you the last time I saw Sigma being played on any Lijiang map ever. Winston. Because of how bad the other tanks are on this map, Watchpoint Gibraltar kinda has to be Winston's pick. Very traditional dive map, plenty of cover to retreat to and get your cooldowns back, and not too long sightline either. Numbani is also a good shout here too, though third point Numbani is definitely his worst part. Speaking of long sightlines and a lack of cover, Junkertown is what I think to be Winston's worst map. I challenge anyone watching this video to play Winston on Junkertown first point attack and cap first points, because unless your snipers carry, you're really not going to be doing shit on this map. Wrecking Ball. New Queen Street is what I think to be Ball's best map here, plenty of flanks and rotations for you to make and get some roll throughs from behind, whilst also not being very long sightlines. Worst map I think has to be Circle Royale or Junkertown. Like, what piece of map geometry are you grappling off of on these maps? Like, it's not gonna happen. Also, not too many flank routes either, especially on Circle Royale. Zarya. Zarya is a weird one because she likes close to medium range, but doesn't want to get rolled over by a Reinhardt or Ramattra. She also doesn't like high ground much. All in all, I'd say King Zo is a pretty strong map for her, only really struggling on third points. Bastion Mecha Base, Midtown, and Oasis Gardens are good shots for her too. As for her worst maps, I'm really not a fan of Zarya on Numbani until it's third points, and she's pretty bad on Pariso too. Ashe. As soon as I typed Ashe into my script, Route 66 immediately came into my mind. Medium range sightlines, plenty of high ground and angles for you to land those juicy dynamites, and Vialto, Pariso, Dorado, and Ilios Lighthouse are good shouts too. Worst map I'd say is Circle Royale. The issue isn't that Ashe is bad on this map per se, it's just that Widow is the much better pick here, and honestly, it was tough choosing a map for Ashe, so let me know your thoughts down below. Bastion. Best maps for Bastion are super linear ones that have short to medium sightlines. As a result, Lijiang is up there, Nepal Shrine and Nepal Village are up there too, as well as Bastion Mecha Base. However, as soon as we open up the map and there's some long sightlines and big flanks to take, Bastion really falls down in value. New Queen Street, Ilios Ruins, Junkertown, and Circle Royale are pretty rough with this guy. Cassidy. Best map is honestly almost all of them. Cassidy is just such an all-round hero that it's tough saying that King's Row is better than Blizzard World, for example, when they're both pretty good maps for him. Worst map I'm gonna say is Circuit Royale. I don't know how many times I'm gonna say this map in this video, but it probably shows how terrible the map design of Circuit Royale is. If you're gonna make a long sightlined map, at least have flanks you can take on attack. Gibraltar attack is also pretty weak for Cassidy. Echo. I think her best map is Oasis Gardens. There's a ton of cover, rooftops and flanks for you to land your stickies and beam combo, and I think if you're creative on Circuit Royale, she's surprisingly strong. Worst map is actually somewhat tough to choose for Echo. Comp-wise, I think she's really weak against Sombra Tracer because she can't take a flank or an angle, so maybe New Queen Street if you're playing up against that specific comp. Long range maps where she has to close the distance is where Echo can also be tough to run. Genji. Best map, and this might come as a shock to some of you, I think is Havana or Rialto. There's a ton of high ground he can control and reach to, and up close, he can out-drill a Widowmaker or an Ashe on that high grounds. Third point Havana though might be a struggle. With worst maps, similar to Echo, I think Genji suffers more against the comps he plays against rather than the map he plays on. But with that being said, I'm not a particular fan of Genji on Lijiang or Oasis University. I think they're too broady for him to do anything on. Hanzo. His best map I honestly think is King's Row. Specifically against dive, Hanzo is pretty weak, and he also does pretty well in broady matchups. King's Row is classic for that, and third points also has high grounds that Hanzo can utilize. The worst maps I'd say are Ilios Ruins, Nepal Village, and Lijiang Control Center, either too long sightlines or not enough angles for him to take. Then again, I am struggling on choosing a map where Hanzo really isn't that great. Junkrat. Of course he's going to be pretty strong on Lijiang Control Center, where just by accidents his grenades will hit, but I think Antarctic Peninsula is pretty underrated. Worst map I think is either Junkertown or Hollywood. Hollywood might be a weird choice, but on attack, I think he's really tough to pull off because of the sightlines and oppressive high grounds. And on defense, I just think there's better heroes to play. Mei. Thrives on maps where you can get guaranteed value from your wall. King's Row, Colosseo, Oasis University, and Lijiang Control Center are all obvious and basic picks here, but Eichenwald, barring second points, she's also pretty strong too. Maps where the geometry is more open may can be a struggle to run. New Queen Street is a perfect example of such, and yes, I am aware of the stalling gimmick you can do, but apart from that, there's really not much going for Mei on this map. Oasis City Center I also think she can struggle on. Pharah. I actually think she's very underrated on Lijiang Control Center because of the little bit of high grounds you can use as cover. And for that same reason, Dorado, Rialto, New Queen Street, and Eichenwald can tend to be pretty strong for her too. More specifically, the first points for Dorado and Rialto. Tons of roofs and high buildings to use as cover. Worst map is likely anything on Antarctic Peninsula. Sightlines are way too short and brawly, and the map is relatively open, meaning it's hard for Pharah to use a concussive blast to close the distance. Reaper. Cover is really important for Reaper to close the distance safely, so Nepal Shrine, Antarctic Peninsula, Busan Mecha Base, or at least a single map on every Koth map is pretty good for Reaper. Reaper's biggest weakness, however, is his range. Good luck flanking and making sure that it's not telegraphed on something like Circuit Royale. Sojourn. Similar to most DPSs, I think you can get away with Sojourn on most maps, so choosing our best one is pretty difficult to say the least. I'd probably choose Rialto, Esperanza, or New Queen Street because of the rotations you can take to different angles, whilst also retaining your railgun charge. Those maps also aren't too long sightlines. Her worst map on the other hand are maps where there's just other more efficient picks to choose from, which mainly come down to compositions to be honest. Lijiang Control Center is up there, as well as any long range map too. Soldier 76. This might be controversial, but apart from third points, Havana I think is really strong for Soldier. Plenty of places to sprint and rotate to, and the sightlines aren't too long. Essentially, just maps where you can sprint to different angles I think can be pretty strong for Soldier. Worst map might be Colosseo. Soldier doesn't have that much frontline pressure compared to someone like Mei, and angles you can take on Colosseo require vertical mobility, which Soldier doesn't really have. Sombra. Again, I think composition has to do a lot with whether Sombra is a good pick or not, instead of the map. Relatively open maps with sightlines that aren't too long, I think she's pretty good in, like Oasis City Center, Ilios Well, Busan Sanctuary, or New Queen Streets. Her worst map is tough to say, because her worst heroes are Cassidy and Hanzo, who only need to land 1 or 2 shots to force translocates. As a result, Kingzo could be a solid shout, not to mention, Sombra also can't access high ground unless she wastes her translocates. Symmetra. Thankfully, Symmetra is pretty simple. Her best map is likely Lijiang in my opinion, just generally speaking across all the 3 maps. Short sightline and brawly to allow her to get to level 3 beam, whilst also having classic teleport plays for herself and her team. Worst map is probably Circuit Royale. The reason why I didn't pick Junkertown is that whilst both maps are super long sightlines, Circuit Royale is very linear until 3rd point, meaning it can be hard to flank with your TP. Torbjörn. Weirdly enough, I think Torb's best map is Blizzard Worlds. Some classic spots to put your turret on, and the sightlines suit Torb pretty well. Generally speaking though, I think Torb is just better on defense than attack. With Torb's worst maps, despite Torb lacking the range, making him not a great pick on sniper-based maps, on attack, when trying to walk into an enemy team utilising high ground, Torb is really gonna struggle. Watchpoint Gibraltar and Hollywood Attack are great examples of such. Tracer. Best map is New Queen Street, so many flanks to take, and not too much high ground from stopping you. Worst map is King's Row. First point is too linear, and the flanks and angles you can take are typically on high grounds. With that being said, Tracer is by no means a bad pick or unplayable in King's Row, which just goes to show how strong she is. Widowmaker. Best map is Savannah, Circuit Royale, or Bastion Downtown, and worst map is Lijiang Control Center. No discussion needed. Ana. The best maps for her are ones where you can get cheeky nades off on rotations. King's Row, Rialto, even Antarctic Peninsula and the Lijiang and Nepal maps are pretty solid picks for her too. With worst maps, I believe ML7 had once said her worst map was Ilios Ruins because of how long the sightlines are, but there honestly aren't too many maps where it's straight up unplayable to pick Ana. Baptiste. He thrives on maps or situations where you're running a hard brawl comp or where you're running a hard poke comp. Zen Bap is always going to do well on Circuit Royale, and Lucio Bap is always going to do well on Lijiang or Antarctic Peninsula. Individually, places where Baptiste can get value off his Exo boots in order to deal damage, like Route 66, are also good places for Bap. As for his worst maps, again, it's mostly composition based. In other words, playing Baptiste with dive. And for that reason, I'd say Watchpoint Gibraltar or Numbani could be weak for Bap, even though there's plenty of high grounds for you to Exo jump up to. Brigitte. As a glorified Brig main myself, I have to say I love playing Brig on Dorado. So many different angles and high grounds that you can control, I always get excited whenever I get Dorado, since Brig is pretty free on both attack and defense. As for her worst map, it's gotta be long-range maps or short-ranged brawling maps where you might as well be playing Mercy or Lucio respectively. Junkertown and Lijiang are good respective examples, though I will say Sigma Brig as a frontline isn't half bad. Kiriko. Super versatile, but her best maps are ones where she can hard flank and teleport back to her team with relative safety. King's Row on all 3 points is a perfect example of such, but you could honestly argue any map is Kiriko's best because that's how flexible she is. Her worst maps are ones that are super linear and force Kiriko into a heal bot playstyle, which isn't always a bad thing, but if you're running snipers, you might as well be playing Zen, which is why on Circuit Royale and Junkertown, you need to be hard flanking. Lifeweaver. Okay, so moving on, Lucio. The obvious choice here is Ilios because of the Reddit and boot potential, but speaking more competitively, I think Lucio is really strong on King's Row and Rialto, not just in terms of speeding your tank in, but also contesting high ground in the mid-fight too. For general speed and brawl though, Lijiang is always going to be a top pick. His worst maps are where you just don't need the speed boost and your comp is mainly stationary, which is why for the 100th time in this video, Circuit Royale is once again not a great pick for Lucio. Mercy. Any maps with a ranged hit scan, like Ashe, Hanzo, Widow, Sojourn, or Soldier can do well on, she'll do well on too. Route 66, Numbani, Esperanza, Rialto, and of course, the classic long-range maps will suit Mercy just fine. As for her worst map, Lijiang Control Center just has to be it. Way too short sight-lined and very easy for her to get run over by a Lucio comp. Moira. Low-key, she's kinda strong in Midtown. Fading to high ground and dueling DPS, as well as being within range to heal your team, is a pretty flexible playstyle. King's Row and Iconwald are also solid examples of this too. With her worst maps, I find that when people struggle with Moira, it's more of a playstyle thing than a map thing necessarily. She's a budget Kiriko, so in maps where it's super hard to flank, like on Circuit Royale, for the 1000th time, she's probably gonna struggle. Zenyatta. Range is the name of the game with Zenyatta, which is why Koth maps, generally speaking, aren't really great picks for him. Of course, on your standard long maps, Zen is going to do well in, but surprisingly, I don't think Lijiang Control Center is a terrible map for Zen, unlike Mercy, which is mainly because of Discord and Zen's own damage. Instead, I think something like Ilios Lighthouse, which is super awkward for Zen's positioning, can really be a hindrance. And that's it for the video. Shout out to my tier 1 and tier 3 patrons, and let me know your own thoughts down below. Until next time.